So lately I've been focusing on the concept of technocracy, but the historical roots of these movements always catch my attention. Multiple organizations from around the world seem to have been pursuing a consistent agenda for more than 100 years, quietly and relentlessly, across continents and generations. This is a thread in a much bigger web, one that spans from the late 1700s with Thomas Malthus all the way to the 1930s technocracy movement in North America, which was led by figures like Howard Scott and even the grandfather of Elon Musk. These people envisioned a world run by engineers, not nations. And that's just a reflection of what the Fabians were cooking up across the pond, really. Just to be clear, I'm not saying the technocrats and the Fabians work together. There's no documented proof of that. But rather, there is an ideological parallel. Although, I will say, it's pretty wild how these movements kicked off at similar times around the world. Some say they popped up independently and organically, others point to a concerted effort from a centralized body, slipping these ideas into the mainstream. Regardless, their subversive nature have led to where we are today. It's been a slow burn, over a century in the making. So Justin Trudeau's resignation and Mark Carney stepping in, another World Economic Forum puppet by the way, well, it pushed me to dig into this topic. While chasing down connections, I stumbled upon an article from Unlimited Hangout written by Matthew Arrett. It was all about the Trudeau family, how Justin and his father Pierre engineered crises to justify emergency measures, a textbook move from a playbook much older than they are. But what really grabbed me was a section on the Fabian Society, and that's where I'm headed with this video. Matthew Arrett's article is great through and through, but I'm going to be adding my own thoughts, tangents, and entirely new context, so check the link in the pinned comment for the original. Now, all of that's going to come into play later, but first, to unravel this tangled web, we need to start with Thomas Malthus. You've probably heard me and others mention the Malthusian death cult, haven't you? Well, it all traces back to this guy. His theories laid the grim foundation for a cascade of malevolent agendas. The Club of Rome, with its foreboding Limits to Growth manifesto in 1972, penned by elitists like Aurelio Pesci and Alexander King, bankrolled by the Rockefellers, mind you. They prophesized resource collapse and societal ruin, and then that transformed into Agenda 21, and later, Agenda 2030. Cloaked in sustainable development, yet steeped in control and political power. Yeah. From the halls of the UK royal family to the calculated US political elite, and every scheming figure whispering at Davos, the global aristocracy clings to this doctrine of desolation. Every one of their most diabolical plans, from population control to manufactured crises, open borders, and the erosion of sovereignty. Truth be told, it all springs from this dark well of Malthusian thought. Woven into the very fabric of every establishment political initiative, this theory casts a large shadow and threatens our very existence. Now some might call that fear-mongering, but with their focal point being that we need to get rid of a couple billion people, well, I don't think it's a stretch for me to say that, alright? Anyway, Thomas Malthus was an English economist born in 1766. His most infamous work, an essay on the principles of population, came out in 1798. It introduced a grim theory that would reverberate throughout the centuries. Population growth, if unchecked, would inevitably outstrip the Earth's finite resources, plunging mankind into an abyss of famine, disease, and despair. Malthus argued that population increases geometrically, doubling and redoubling in a relentless march, while food production grows only arithmetically, a slow crawl. This imbalance, he warned, would trigger positive checks, like starvation and war. Yeah, positive checks, like starvation and war, or preventative checks like delayed marriage and abstinence. But he did not stop there. He also claimed that it would lead to cruelty, barbarism, and inhumane acts from the masses, eating each other as a turn of phrase, which would bring the world's population back to sustainable levels. And you see people in today's version of the Club of Rome use the same exact talking points as Thomas Malthus, hundreds of years later.
But in one way or another, we are so far, globally, we are so far above the population and the consumption levels which can be supported by this planet that I know in one way or another it's going to come back down. So I don't hope to avoid that. I hope that it can occur in a civil way, and I mean civil in a special way, peaceful. Peace doesn't mean that everybody's happy, but it means that conflict isn't solved through violence, through force, but rather in other ways. And so that's what I hope for. That we can, the planet can support something like 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion, depending on how much liberty and how much material consumption you want to have. If you want more liberty and more consumption, you have to have fewer people.
And so Thomas Malthus's viewpoint was a world governed by a cold mathematical inevitability, where nature itself would act as the reaper. He drew inspiration from a mix of Enlightenment rationality and the stark realities of his time. You see, the late 18th century was a period of booming populations, enclosures of common land, and early industrial revolutions. Conditions that seemed to foreshadow the resource crisis he predicted. A cleric by training, his ideas had a moralistic tinge, suggesting that the poor, with their supposed reckless breeding, were complicit in their own suffering. Critics of his day accused him of heartlessness, yet his theories took root, influencing economists like David Ricardo and even Charles Darwin, whose theory of natural selection owes a quiet debt to the Malthusian struggle. However, if you fast forward to today, the specter of Malthusian politics looms larger than ever, as they claim our world is straining under the weight of 8 billion souls.
So in the session we just attended here at the Economic Forum, I think there was a sense of relief, actually, in your frankness. You brought up some issues that others are reluctant to bring up.
Always. All the religious groups are against me because I'm talking about population. They want more souls. I want less on the planet.
And so the term Malthusian now evokes a worldview steeped in dread, the belief that humanity teeters on the brink of collapse as population pressures clash with dwindling resources. It's a narrative that thrives in an era of climate chaos. Or so they want you to believe, because I don't subscribe to that viewpoint, as you all know. The point, though, is that Malthus's theory didn't fade. It morphed into today's green agenda. It's true, the pulse of Malthus beats in the rise of eco-fascist rhetoric, where some whisper that only culling the herd can save the planet. And in their sterile calculus, policymakers weigh human lives against carbon budgets. Population versus resource scarcity remains the heart of this modern Malthusian nightmare. The United Nations projects a global population nearing 10 billion by 2050, while the World Resource Institute warns that food demand could outstrip supply by 60% in that same span. They claim oil reserves are dwindling, rare earth minerals are vanishing to the tech-hungry, and the Amazon, the lungs of the earth, choke under the axe. In fact, just as something crazy to show you, check out this post from Josh Walkos. A new 4-lane highway is being built that cuts through tens of thousands of acres of protected Amazon rainforest for the COP30 Climate Summit. Yeah, they're cutting down the rainforest to make way for a climate summit. You couldn't make that up if you tried. It's so crazy, I don't even know what to say, really. You have some irony, some hypocrisy, some idiocy, and a superiority complex all residing on different levels of that shit show. Anyway, Malthusian politics today cloaks itself in green virtue, with thinkers and activists arguing that overpopulation is the root of ecological ruin. Some point to Africa's soaring birth rates or Asia's booming cities as harbingers of doom, reviving Malthus's old specter of the undeserving poor who multiply beyond Earth's capacity. Yet the real ominous twist lies in the solutions whispered in the corners of events like Davos. Where Thomas Malthus once saw nature as the executioner, today's Malthusians, whether technocrats or just run-of-the-mill political extremists, well, they sometimes hint at human hands taking up the task. From eugenics to forced sterilization and population control policies, well, they rear their ugly head in establishment circles, while even the mainstream voices ask, who gets to survive when the resources run dry? The irony is bitter. Malthus himself underestimated human ingenuity and technological leaps that have so far staved off his apocalypse. But that right there isn't stopping these politicians who clamor for mass death. They preach the climate tipping point is coming, changing their timeline as they see fit, and it's almost as if it's not about resources at all, or climate change, and it's all just another manipulation. And it kind of sounds like that because that's exactly what it is. Whatever the case, the architects of society seem unbothered and undeterred. To them, the ledger remains unbalanced. They view it as a numbers game, where human life is just a bullet point. Malthusian politics isn't just a theory, it's in practice. We see it every single day. But to me, it only acts as more of an excuse for some of the elite's darkest desires than anything else. Now, whatever the truth is, I'm not even sure if it matters, because they're continuously moving forward to reducing carbon, even if that carbon is you. Okay, so now let's jump over to that article by Matthew Arrett, and I quote, The British Malthusian movement had great influence over global politics, which worked to permeate many branches of government during the first half of the 20th century. Now, as far as I understand it, this wasn't just a Fabian project or Malthusian. It intertwined with the Rhodes-Milner Roundtable, a shadow group founded by Cecil Rhodes and Lord Milner to cement their rule worldwide. And so they created the Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations, copying the Fabians' tactic of slow burn infiltration. This Malthusian movement, directed from the London-centered global intelligence apparatus, had been attempting to impose a program in Canada and elsewhere that the Fabian Society leader H.G. Wells described in detail in his 1940 book, The New World Order. Put simply, this program was essentially a transformation away from the nation-state model and towards a new model of social organization based on depopulation, eugenics, and a one-world government. The Fabian Society was established in 1884 by a group of British eugenicists and Malthusians in order to promote a new social order designed to mold society into a new, mechanized system run by the social scientists from the top down. Now, the choice of the title Fabian was derived from the Roman general Quintius Fabius Maximus Vercocius, who was renowned for his strategy of defeating his enemies through superhuman patience and slow attrition. And damn, these people are diabolical. Anyway, the Fabian philosophy was displayed in an infamous stained glass piece of art, featuring Fabian leaders George Bernard Shaw and Sidney Webb as blacksmiths hammering the world into their own secular image, and featuring a shield of the Fabian logo of a wolf in sheep's clothing. And yeah, that's a perfect representation of their true identity right there. Their logo is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Come on, people, it's right in front of your eyes. Anyway, and I quote again, unlike the conventional brute force approach of conservative British imperialists, who often opted for a scorched earth method of destroying their victims, the Fabians prided themselves on playing a more peaceful, yet subtle and deadly long game. Rather than push for big wars, which could risk heavy losses for the oligarchy itself, the Fabians understood that it was better to promote slow attrition and infiltration using the Jesuit technique of permeation. Historian Stephen O'Neill wrote the following of the Fabian Society's guiding principle of permeation theory. Despite their traditional political image, the Fabians, under the impetus of Sidney Webb, thought they had a new weapon in the policy of permeation. It was through the utilization of this tactic, according to Webb, that the Fabians, in the spirit of the Trojans and the legendary horse, would enter the ranks and minds of the politically influential by providing them with programs, ideas, opinion, and research, heavily documented with statistics, that would be conveniently drafted into public policy. Throughout the 20th century, the Fabian Society would penetrate branches of government, military, academia, media, and private corporate boards around the world, often hand in hand with the Rhodes-Milner network. And yeah, that kind of reminds me of what the World Economic Forum is doing today.
Young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, half of this government, are actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. We penetrate the cabinets. The change is not just happening. The change can be shaped by us. We have to prepare for a more angry world. How to prepare? Take the necessary action to create a fairer world. I see the need for a great reset. So people assume we are just going back to the good old world which we had, and everything will be normal again. This is, let's say, fiction. It will not happen.
Anyway, from below, the plebs would be attracted by buzzwords promoted by Fabians like equality, social justice, and redistribution of wealth that were ultimately hollow, as their powerful networks had no intention of manifesting what those words actually mean. And we still see that happen today. Old tactics and recycled messaging. However, like the Jesuits and Masonic orders, many Fabians would never have a clue what those at the top of their organization intended for society on a global scale. And this is why the British Labour Party, who used to be known as the Fabian Party of Britain, and a quick aside, I'm surprised that I did not know that before. But anyway, he goes on to say that they attracted well-intended members who never had a clue what the game was truly about. The official Fabian school that became an ideological control hub and recruiting ground for next-generational talent was the London School of Economics. And again, that reminds me of Klaus Schwab's Young Global Leader program, co-opting future leaders into their cult. Now this part right here will send a chill down your spine, as many so-called leaders today agree with the sentiment. And now, get ready for this one. But I'm going to paraphrase to keep things moving. However, you can find the original quote on the screen. So, we have George Bernard Shaw, and he laid out the Fabian eugenics vibe very clearly in 1934. basically saying that the community should decide who's worth keeping alive. Fit folks get decent lives, unfit ones get a quote-unquote humane death in a lethal chamber to stop them from dragging everybody else down. And yeah, man, these people are diabolical, as I said. However, from there, H.G. Wells was equally explicit in many of his nonfiction writings, saying in 1904, and I quote, "The way of nature has always been to slay the hindmost, and there is still no other way, unless we can prevent those who would become the hindmost being born. It is in the sterilization of failure, and not in the selection of success for breeding, that the possibility of an improvement of the human stock lies." End of quote. Yeah, so basically that echoes the view of Margaret Sanger, you know what I mean? Anyway, from there, in his work Open Conspiracy, which came out in 1928, H.G. Wells targeted the institution of the sovereign nation-state itself, which had to be purged in favor of a new structure of global governance. And I quote, "It is the system of nationalist individualism that has to go. We are living in the end of sovereign states. In the great struggle to evoke a westernized world socialism, contemporary governments may vanish. Countless people will hate the New World Order and will die protesting against it." End of quote. Yeah, so individualism has to go so global government can rise. And man, oh man, if you need more proof, I mean, this is it. We are ruled by evil, evil people. And this has been the case for a long, long time. But get this. Later on in 1932, H.G. Wells, ever the devout eugenicist, stated that all progressives and social reformers must become liberal fascisti, enlightened Nazis. And yeah, well, that's exactly what they became. So there you go. Mission accomplished, I guess. And from here, the article goes on to detail how the Fabian Society infiltrated Canada, as Wells spoke those words in 1932. The Fabian Society of Canada was constituted under the title of the League of Social Reconstruction, with the aim of solving the problems of the Great Depression with a scientifically managed socialist order. Pierre Trudeau's Rhodes Scholar ties, mentored by figures like William Yandell Elliott, plugged him into this nexus, and this was alongside the technocracy fervor his contemporary elites flirted with. And then they recruited the Trudeau family into their ranks. Now, if you look at Justin Trudeau's policies, the Fabian fingerprints are all over it, to this day. And you're not going to get anything different with Mark Carney, cut from the same globalist cloth, and they have Klaus Schwab's hand firmly pulling the strings. And while this article focuses on Canada, I'd like to remind you that this was always a global agenda from the very beginning, and it was planned to be implemented through the long game, a con, to slowly manipulate entire nations into servitude. One of their initial objectives was to de-Christianize society, as they believed secular structures would grant them complete control. A one-world government and religion aren't exactly compatible, and this also applies to a technocratic society, as it's impossible to implement because a core belief in our political framework is that our rights are granted by God, not by the state. Consequently, the state lacks the authority to deprive individuals of their fundamental human rights, and of course that foundational concept directly obstructs their agenda, which is another reason as to why we see talking points like this.
Now, you may find it possible to accept that in the religious field, cooperation is based on fiction. That a lot of people, a lot of strangers come together to build a cathedral or a synagogue or a mosque or go on crusade together because they all believe the same stories about God and heaven and hell and so forth. But what I want to emphasize is that exactly the same thing happens in all other fields of human cooperation. In the legal field, in the political field, in the economic field as well. Take the legal field as an example. Today in the world, many, maybe most legal systems are based on this idea, this belief in human rights. But human rights are just like heaven and like God. It's just a fictional story that we've invented and spread around. It may be a very nice story, it may be a very attractive story, we want to believe it, but it's just a story. It's not a reality.
Yeah, these people are downright ghoulish. So it seems to me like they used the West as a testing ground, dismantling faith and tradition to pave way for a managerial state. And we're still seeing this happen to this day. It's been a slow march toward what we are witnessing happen in our everyday life. Most of these social movements are just hidden attacks on religious principles or morality in general, And you see hordes of people who have filled that vacuum, the absence of belief, with the belief in the almighty government. They worship the state. In fact, they were really trying to do this with the science. It became an almost religious doctrine in of itself. It was just a twist on scientism. Just pathetic levels of philosophical understanding on their part, to be honest. It made me sick. As stated, it was all aimed at nothing short of bringing society under a system of predictability and control, under a scientifically managed world government. And this is also where cybernetics comes in, the science of control, championed by Norbert Wiener, adopted by Fabians and technocrats alike, to rewire society like a machine. Eric's article here notes a cybernetics technocratic overhaul in Canada post-1970. Think of it as like a master key to their vision. Although, for this deconstruction of pre-existing values to occur, H.G. Wells and other Fabian thinkers reasoned that society would have to be purged of its traditional Judeo-Christian values. And it's in this sense that all forms of individualism that H.G. Wells refers to are simply causes for uncertainty and uncontrollable change in the mind of a social engineer, and hence must be purged. According to H.G. Wells, only a materialist society motivated by selfish impulses under a system of fixed resources can be controlled in a predetermined fashion. This is often dubbed a quiet revolution, and we still see this specific verbiage today. But I like to point to a certain quote, which came from the UN Secretary General in 1998, when Kofi Annan called the public-private partnerships with the UN a quiet revolution. And yeah, that's just merging the private sector with the government. This, after all, is how they build their technocratic society, through people like Bill Gates, Tim Cook, Sam Altman, Peter Thiel, and Elon Musk. Those are just a few examples from all sides of the spectrum to keep it fair. However, if each nation is viewed as a battlefield, then the actual war is for humanity's soul, and it's going digital. So Thomas Malthus feared too many bodies, but today's technocrats fear unenhanced ones. Enter transhumanism, their final solution. What if the Fabians' quiet revolution wasn't just to rule us, but instead was actually to replace us? From Malthusian theory to brain-computer interfaces, the elite have always dreamed of a world where they're gods and we're obsolete relics. H.G. Wells hinted at this in The Time Machine. You have the Eloi, a pacified herd, and the Morlocks, a hidden elite. Today, Peter Thiel chases immortality with blood infusion, Elon Musk wires brains with Neuralink, and Ray Kurzweil preaches the singularity. Cybernetics scales into AI-driven social credit systems, China's model, admired at Davos, and biometric tracking grids. They're not just controlling us, they're transcending us, promising salvation through uploads in biotech, while the masses become obsolete. De-Christianization and ending faith in general wasn't just for power. It was to replace our faith with their techno-religion. But let's get back to the article, and I quote again. The psychology of the oligarchical social engineers attempting to manage the behavioral transformation of Canadians and the world into a complacent, docile herd of cattle has not changed over 50 years. I would say more, but anyway. While many of the particular managers of this empire have come and gone over the decades, the principal conditions of the fight between two opposing views of humankind still endure. Where one view is represented by those who believe in the rights of every individual, and the other view is represented by transhumanists, neo-eugenicists, technocrats who demand submission and assimilation into the only permitted reality by all citizens and nations. Just as it was over 50 years ago, today's generation of sociopathic technocrats and the oligarchical hive mind they represent suffer from one powerful Achilles heel. That is, they believe their own propaganda and genuinely see themselves as some kind of godlike immortal who are divinely ordained to sit above the slavish, depopulated, and dumbed-down mortals forever. It is that hubris and arrogance which also ensures a religious-like inflexibility to bend to a higher truth when it has been demonstrably presented in the systems they wish to control. Instead, this parasitic culture will always be guaranteed to use the same methods and modus operandi decade after decade, without any capacity to self-criticize their own fundamental operating system, despite how flawed it is. Yes, dirty tricks will be used, false flags deployed to lay blame on the innocent, false protest groups will be created to attract well-intended fools, the useful idiots. And of course, division and discord will be sown wherever possible. And where those techniques fail, the oligarchy's true colors will be forced out of the shadows, and the face of evil, which despises the light of truth, will continuously be forced into the spotlight. So long as humans committed to their own humanity continue to mobilize in peace and wisdom for their rights, despite the threats posed to our individual security or even mortal existence, well, then this natural expression of true civilization will spread like a Promethean fire, in ways that no mathematical model or technocratic control freak will ever be able to control. End of quote. Well, that's all I have for you. Make sure you check out the original article, and yeah, I hope you found it interesting. Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals, or you can use PayPal. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas. And yes, I do hope you have a good night.